Okay, I was not going to film a reading vlog so quickly after I finished the other one, but I'm okay, I'm just dying. I started The Shadow Casket by Chris Wooding, which is the sequel to The Ember Blade, which is on my top 10 books of all time. It's absolutely fantastic. This is really overexposed. Let me darken this down. You can actually make out colour now, it's not too bright. Good stuff. Let's talk about Shadow Casket. And they just came through the door the other day, and I knew as soon as I finished Jade War, I have to jump into Shadow Casket. Plan was to start it, read a bit, you know, chip away at it over time. That's all fine and well. And I've got a cold. I don't normally read when I've got a cold because effort. But I started it and I read the first couple chapters and it's so good. Much like the first one, Chris Wooding does something, I don't even know what it is, it's magic. It's just he sprinkles magic into the pages that immediately creates atmosphere. And I don't know how he does it, it's so good. You know that almost childlike wonder you get from reading Lord of the Rings, The Wheel of Time, and sprinkled it into his own work, and it's a terrible angle, isn't it? Let's just come here. Let's talk about this book, okay? God, this video's a mess already. Okay, so a little about the premise. The Ember Blade is a very classical fantasy type story, but through a modern lens. So it's got the modern conveniences of prose and pacing, I guess. That being said, there's still, you know, over 800 pages, as is The Shadow Casket. So you still have that super deep world building and detail you expect from a fully fleshed out fantasy world, but there's none of the overly excessive descriptions that you would get maybe in some of the older classical fantasy series. But I picked up The Shadow Casket and I read the first 3 chapters, something like that, and very little happens in the first 3 chapters. You can expect that from an 800 page chonker, but the tone, the atmosphere, it's like Bilbo running through the Shire saying he's going on an adventure. That's how it feels to pick up this series. Like I said, I don't normally read when I have a cold, but it's just, I just want to read it. I don't want to do anything else. I have so much I need to do, and none of it's happening because I have to read The Shadow Casket. Right here, right now. That's where we are. You know, we're in a good place. I love when I find a fantasy book like this. It's so rare, especially when I've read loads of favourites in the last year, but so few of them, even favourites, don't have this kind of feeling when you read it. And as a writer as well, I am so jealous of being able to do that. It's unreal. It's so good. So good. I'm just going to apologise now for this reading vlog. It's probably going to be all over the place. And hopefully it's going to be a lot of gushing. Okay, that's a check-in.
Hey, you. You're finally awake.
As for reading, I have shaken this cold, but the fever that is The Shadow Casket is still going strong. I am currently 188 pages into The Shadow Casket, and I have thoughts. It was a slow start, but I really wanted a slow start, and I really enjoyed the slow start. We get to kind of go into some of the character relationships between the cast of characters. There is a wee bit more teenage angst than I remember there being in Ember Blade. I don't know if this is just, it wasn't in the first book and it's just kind of evolved into this because they are quite a young cast of characters. It's just not something I had expected. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. It's not my favourite type of... However, I guess it kind of makes sense given the age of the main characters. I always imagine them as like a little older than they actually are. I still absolutely adore these characters, so... It has got some tropes that I don't know if they're considered spoilers or not, so I'm wary of saying them, that I know a lot of people hate. There's kind of this love... I'm just going to say it. There's kind of this love triangle, and there's a bit of miscommunication between the cast of characters, which I know is a big no-no to a lot of people, but I do want to highlight that as a wee... Also, we got the return of Dread Knights. They're so cool. I absolutely loved the Dread Knights in book 1. I like that they're all different and kind of almost like a class, each a class of their own. And I'd really like to learn more about their past and where they came from, which I believe we do get in this book, because I was watching Petrick's interview with the author, Chris Wooding. And it was a spoiler-free interview, but he did make a little comment about, and in this book we got to talk a wee bit more about the Dread Knights and where they came from. So I'm looking forward to that, because I absolutely love the Dread Knights. They're awesome. Terrible, villainly, but awesome. As a side note, it turns out I'm an idiot. For some reason, when I read the Shadow Casket, in my head, I had the Shadow Musket, as in those really old-fashioned guns. I assumed we were going to get guns in this. And I don't know why. It makes no sense given the time period and the world. But I just had Casket as musket in my head. So I was like, why are they talking about this thing when it's a big gun, right? We know what a musket is. Why has he changed the usage of the word for this? It's not a musket. If anyone else was stupid enough to fall down that pitfall, that is not a pitfall because only I fell down because I'm an idiot. There's no muskets. Can confirm. I know I'm an idiot. I know. This is a problem of filming vlogs. Yeah, I can actually see me being an idiot in real time instead of me retroactively not talking about that part of the reading experience. I have also been listening to House of Blades by Will White on Audible. I've actually been listening to this for a pretty long time. I think I've been listening to it for like a month, and it's a pretty short book. I've just kind of been chipping away. I started it, and then when I got really into Jade War, I downloaded the audiobook to Jade War so I could swap between the physical and the audio and just keep it going. But now I'm going back to House of Blades, and I wasn't grabbed at the beginning. I didn't immediately love it. I had a hard time really connecting to the characters. The world building was really cool. The magic was really cool, but there's 3 characters. I didn't connect to any of them. The most interesting character was the Leia? Is that her name? Female character? Because she's kind of got a bit more of a mysterious background, and I think she was a point of view for 1 chapter. So we didn't really get much of her. Really focused on, I suck at remembering names, Simon? I think Simon's the main character, and Alan's this other character. And Alan and his plotline, I could not care less about. He's kind of this arrogant chosen one, and we just haven't got enough of him yet that I don't feel any connection to him as a person. I don't see where he's going. I don't feel invested in him at all. Simon, it was the same sort of situation. He was okay. He was probably, pretty standard. Wasn't overly connected to him, but he was fine. However, it all sounds really negative. I know. I was just kind of mixed on the start, and I don't know if it's just because I've been listening to it over a long period of time. However, let me just caveat all that. I'm now loving it. We've actually gotten to the House of Blades now, Valenhall, and it's so much fun. It's so cool. We've pretty much all narrowed in on Simon as a character, and there is cutaways to Alan still, and I still not that bothered about Alan, whatever he's doing. But the Simon stuff in the House of Blades is so cool. Such a unique setting. I love all the little room characters and all the unique quirks that are to do with this house. And I love Kai as a mentor character with his creepy dolls that he talks to. So I think I'm slightly more than halfway now. I've kind of shot through. The first quarter was really slow, and I just listened to it over a long period of time and I wasn't really connecting. But once you get into Valenhall, I was like, I'm enjoying this now. So I've flown through the second quarter and I'm into the last half of the book now. So I'm really intrigued how it all pulls together. I will update that book as well now, because I'm probably going to finish it within the next couple of days. I think that's you all up to date. That's Shadow Casket, House of Blades on audio. Reading's going pretty well. I just fell up the stairs. How's your day going? So I finished House of Blades, and I have some thoughts. Quite often with a book you find the middle half to be the slowest part, but with House of Blades the middle part was my favourite part of the entire book. There is a section where the main character goes to the House of Blades, and that whole section feels very progression fantasy. I haven't read a lot of progression fantasy, so I don't know if it translates and it's actually considered progression fantasy, but it feels very progression fantasy, which makes sense when it's coming from Will White, the author of the Cradle series. Overall, it was a really fun read. Early on, I did say I wasn't connecting to the characters. I did connect more with the main character in the second half of the book because of the House of Blades element in the middle. It really helped bring out him as a person and his personality. My gripe with the main character is that there is an event that happens maybe a quarter of the way into the book, and it's quite a harrowing event, but it doesn't feel like it really comes up again. It is one of the reasons that he pushes forward into the latter half of the story, but it doesn't feel like we go back to why very often. And I know some people do react that way to events, but I really would have liked to have more thoughtful scenes with him actually working through some of the trauma from that event that happens in the first quarter of the book. Overall, I did really like him as a character though. A lot more than I thought I was going to after the first third, because the first third I was not jibing with any of them. And this goes on to Alan, which is the second main character. We don't get many POV chapters from him, and I'm glad because I did not like following Alan. I actually think that that is the point of Alan's character. In this story, he is the chosen one. He is the one that should be saving the day. And it's Simon who's like, no, I want to save the day. And having the main chosen one character as this sort of arrogant, stuck-up type is actually quite a good idea to have him as the secondary character. I really liked that. So we're not really meant to like Alan as a person. He does have some good values. He's not a terrible person, but I don't like him very much. And I think that's the point. That being said, I still found his sections and his chapters not particularly interesting. I can see why we needed them because it does all come together at the end, but I would have liked more to him maybe. World building and plot. It's cool. It's quite a fast book, but there's not a lot of stuff. This feels very set-up-y. There isn't a lot of movement in the plot. We don't really know what's going on for this overarching story. We're hinted at it, especially at the end. There's big hints to where the story is going, but we don't really go through that story very much in this book. But I didn't mind it. It was very much focused on the characters and setting up the world. And the world building is fascinating. The magic system is super cool. I really like this idea of different realms. Travelers, as they're called, they're basically like wizards that can pull powers from a realm, but you can only be associated with one realm. But people can also travel to those realms. So it's really cool. It's a really interesting magic system to have. I really want to learn more about the realms and the other classes. Again, this feels very progression fantasy. But really, I just want more Valenhall. See if like the House of Blades book was 80% in that house. This would have been like a top tier book. I really enjoyed that section. That is technically one of the realms, is this house called Valenhall, the House of Blades, and it's so cool. It's really, really fun. I don't really want to talk that much about it because I think it's really fun to explore as you go through it, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it as a house. This house and all its inhabitants feel so alive. These side characters that you meet in the house are super unique and interesting, and we do get a bit of lore behind the house and where it came from, and also a bit about the other realms, and that part of the story is really fun. And I will say that the finale was a solid ending to a book. It was just really entertaining, and it was a really good setup for the second and third book, because this is a trilogy. So I will definitely be continuing this story. I will continue with the audiobooks as well, because it is narrated by Travis Baldree, who is the author of Legends and Lattes. But before he did Legends and Lattes, he was, and he still is, a very accomplished audiobook narrator, and he is so good at it. I was going to read Cradle with the physical copies, but now I'm very tempted to read them, to listen to them through the audiobooks. I did take a bit of a break from Shadow Casket, but I have returned to it now, and I'm way over the halfway mark, and I'm loving it. There is so much to say about the Shadow Casket. Now, I think the Shadow Casket is going to be a 5-star read, but I do want to say that it is not a perfect book. Small little gripes that I think will bother other people as well, to do with some of the character motivation. There is a branch of the story pretty early on where they kind of stop what they're doing to go do this other thing, and in the end it's super helpful because you get to do learn about this new information, but I just don't believe that they would leave what they're doing to go do this other thing. But to be fair, they are all minor, and what I'm going to say is, this is one of those rare cases where I love the book, the character, the world, and the atmosphere so much that I can overlook most things. And these are pretty small problems. But just the style of Chris Wooding's Dark Legacy books, they're just so good. I absolutely adore the cast of characters. Grub is one of my favourite characters of all time. Also, I really find Vika a really interesting character, and I don't think enough people talk about her when discussing the Emberblade and the Shadow Casket. This series is very classical fantasy, so she's kind of playing the role of this mentor, the wise wizard, but she's so complex and has so much behind her character that's really interesting to see and follow. The way she battles between being so sure of her convictions and what she's doing, kind of battles with this kind of, I really hope I'm right. And watching her struggle with that is really interesting. Also in the Shadow Casket, we do get an antagonist point of view. And one of the first chapters we get from this antagonist is one of the most heartwarming chapters I've ever read. I remember reading it that night and going, aww. Aww. But the scale of this story is way bigger than Emberblade. It really scales up to this revolution. We get a lot more point of views from other people and in different places across the world. And the way it's starting to all pull together and you're starting to see connections and hints between the different plot lines all coming together. You're like, oh, wait a minute, that's like that, and yeah, that's like that. It's really fun, so I think it will come together really well. I also want to say that it is beautifully written. I absolutely love the way that Chris Wooding writes. It's poetic but not over the top. It's just such a smooth reading experience. So yeah, needless to say, I am really enjoying The Shadow Casket. I think it's going to be a painful ending, and I'm really concerned. I don't really want to leave this world. That's one of the reasons why I've read it over such a long period of time, because I really enjoy just the day by day, what the characters are doing. It's going to be hard waiting for book 3. So I finished The Shadow Casket. It was spectacular. Okay, let's go over the negative things first, and then we can talk about the good stuff. As I said earlier, this isn't a perfect book. There are a couple things that could have been done a wee bit better, and I think will bother some people. First thing is what I talked about earlier about there's a leg of the journey really early on in the book where they go and do this kind of it almost feels like a side quest, but they're taking the main cast and they're doing stuff over here when I don't really feel like there's motivations to go do that when they've got a lot going on in the main plot. Second of all, there is some repetition in the plot line. We kind of go back to an earlier plot line and go over it again, which could bother some people. There is a major part of this book that's kind of just not dealt with in the finale, which I feel like I really would have liked that to have tied in more to the finale. I'm assuming we will get more answers for this plot line in book 3. But this feels very major to book 2, and I don't want to say why because it's a spoiler, but it's pretty major to book 2. So I feel like it would have been nice to have some sort of conclusion with that thread in the finale. And lastly, there is a major character that goes through a lot of character development off screen. I wouldn't mind so much if this was a side character, but this was a major player in the cast, and for them to go through some major developments in their character completely off screen and we don't really see it, it felt like a missed opportunity to really explore that change in their character. Okay, now we got that out of the way. This is such a cool book. I adore these characters so much. And one thing that Wooding did really well with this is there's a big cast of characters and they all go through a really interesting arc and they all have fantastic finales. The last quarter of the book was absolutely... It really pulled on the heartstrings, and the way that Wooding kind of juggled all these characters and their own personal journeys throughout this book, I think was done really well. I said this before, but Chris Wooding has a way to build atmosphere and immersion that's just spectacular. It reminds me a lot of like Lord of the Rings and sort of classic fantasies that really you feel really immersed in the story, and it's quite hard to find in some modern day fantasy. I think the pacing was really well done. This is a long book. It's over 800 pages. But there wasn't any point I felt bored or like, okay, we really need to move on and see what's going on here. Like I said, there is some repetition in one of the arcs of the story, and there was another arc that felt like we're kind of sidestepping a wee bit. And you always knew that it was going to tie back in, because why else would we be doing it? And the thing that Chris Wooding, I think, does really, really well is the rule of cool, which is this idea of just making it cool. The individual scenes are all so interesting to be in. The world building reveals, the locations we visit, they're all very unique and interesting, and they do follow this rule of cool. The way that everything came together, but we followed each of the individual characters, and they all like completed their arcs, and it was all super satisfying for it all to come together. There were plenty twists and turns in the book, I guess some of them, but certainly not most of them. I stand by Grubb is the best. I love Grubb. His humour just really works for me. Grubb Club. There isn't a whole lot more I can say because it's a book 2 and I don't want to spoil stuff in book 1 either. So just go read it, please. It's so good. I genuinely believe this series will be huge. Out of all the books I've recommended, The Ember Blade is the one that most people come back and say, this has become a new favourite. I absolutely love this book. And The Shadow Casket is still new, so we're still getting people getting into it, especially when it's such a chunky book. But this solidifies it as one of my favourite series that I've ever read, and I think it really has appeal for a lot of people because it has a humour, it has the big cast, it has the quest fantasy, it has so much that people love, so many of the tropes that people love. I think people will have gripes with some of the things in this book, but for the most part I think this could be huge when it's finished, especially when book 3 drops and we get the completed trilogy. There's just so much character to this world and these people, and I think everybody should read it. That's it. That's the final thoughts. It's great. It's definitely my favourite book of the year so far. So thank you very much for watching, and let me know if you plan on picking up The Shadow Casket and if you've read The Ember Blade and what you thought of them if you have. And that's it. You should go read it. It's great. Outro.